Hi, it's Joni again, a better Joni than I used to be. And I wanted to talk about my brother Steve and the story around his death. And yeah, well, it was such a bad accident how he died. And I mentioned this in the church abuse testimony. I mentioned that Steve and I were the scapegoats in our family, that our covert narcissistic mother neglected us, and we both ended up, the effects of her neglect and the abuse, we both ended up addicts and alcoholics. He became an addict when he was 13. I was 8 when it happened. And so when I was 8 years old, Steve was pretty much gone. He's the one who took care of me in my childhood. I'm sure as an infant, toddler, little girl. But as a little girl for sure, but I'm assuming that he also was responsible for me as an infant and a toddler. We were always really tight. We were always together in pictures and that kind of thing. But when I was 8, he became an addict and he was pretty much gone from the house. And when I was 8, at that time, when he, went off, he began to run away and get in trouble. And that's the time when I began to wet the bed and bite my fingernails as a little girl. And at the age of 8. And that was also around the same time when I fell in love with Jesus. And so that was wonderful. That was also in the early 70s, and that was around the time of the Jesus Revolution, when the Holy Spirit seemed to be pouring out amongst the hippies and the, yeah, bohemians and that kind of thing. So that was pretty cool. When I think about that, I think, wow, I wonder if that had anything to do with the same time that I fell in love with Jesus as a little girl. Well, anyway, so back to the story of Steve. Fast forward, he continued to, get in and out of trouble his whole life. And then we both were in Houston, Texas at the time of his death, which was in January of 1983. And I was 19 years old. He was 25. He was drunk and he was walking across the street in the dark. It was a big, busy street. Yeah, there was no lighting on this street at the time. It was a street in Houston called Kirkendile, I think is how you pronounce it. It doesn't have an R in it, but that's how I pronounced it. But anyway, so yeah, he was hit by a car, and it was really bad. His body was in half, and of course I knew all the details. It just tormented me for, let's say, 9 years, 8, 9 years. I had nightmares about the impact of the car hitting his body, and it would thrust me up out of bed, awake in the middle of the night, many nights after his death. Also, back up a little, the guy who hit him, it was a hit and run, and the kid had to go to court because of it, and I was the only family member who could attend the court proceedings against this young man. And it really wasn't his fault. It really wasn't. It was an accident. And Steve was not in his right mind. And walking across the street, we don't know where he was going. He was at a party and he was walking across the street. There was a little gas station or something across the street. It was a little convenience store of some kind, but we still don't know why he left the party. But the kid hit him, had to go to court. I was the only family member who could attend because our other family members were in Indiana, California, and our older half brother, he lives in Houston, but he was subpoenaed to testify. And so I was the only one left, and so I had to sit through the court proceedings. But then, as I was saying, after that, for 8 or 9 years, I was tormented with the visions in my mind of how he died, and having seen his blood on the street and after it. And however Jesus, one night I had a dream. It was 8, 9 years after his death, and in the dream, I was holding a rock. And I collect rocks. I was really getting into it at that time in my life. And I've always enjoyed, nature and birds and everything. But anyway, at this point, I was collecting rocks and learning more about rocks and things. And so I had this rock in my hand in the dream. And I looked in the rock, and Steve, my brother, was in the rock. And I said, "Steve, where have you been? I thought you were dead." And all he said to me is, "I am." He said, "I am." And then I woke up. I bolted up in bed this time, but it was different. There was peace in the room, and I knew it had been a God-given dream. Okay, and I was still lost in my addiction during that time when I had that dream. But I never had another nightmarish dream or vision in my head that would burst me up out of bed after that dream. And then I wasn't following Christ at that time. I still had my faith and I believed, but I thought God had long forgotten me. But then some years later, I was telling a fellow believer about the dream. And he explained to him, he interpreted my dream, and he said, "The dream means that your brother is in Jesus." Oh, and I forgot to tell you, but back in the church abuse video that I did, I mentioned about how Peter, a man that I knew then, this was part of my church abuse, was that back after Steve's death, Peter told me that Steve was in hell. And so that's another thing that tormented me all those years. But after I had that dream where Steve was in the rock, I didn't think that he was in hell anymore. I didn't have those nightmares anymore. And then when my believer friend eventually told me that that meant Steve was in Jesus, then I knew. Then I knew I was right. That my God wouldn't send someone so pure and innocent. Steve had his problems. He had addictions. He was never harmful to anyone but himself because of what our mother did to us, to him. And that's the, excuse me, what our mother did to him bothers me more than what she did to me. Even though, and I work on forgiveness a lot because I revert back to being angry at her for what she did and the legacy that she passed on to me and my sister and now our children, and hopefully prayerfully not their children, but anyway, that my intent with this video was to explain how Jesus was there for my brother who didn't deserve the abuse that he suffered on this earth. He made bad choices, bad life choices for himself. But Jesus knew that he didn't deserve hell because he had a good, pure heart. And I have a whole nother video to make about that topic, about the lowly people of the world and how they are so overlooked. But Jesus never overlooks them. He is with them more than he is the righteous. Yep, I'm going to talk more about that in another video. Thank you for listening. I pray this blesses someone.